Hi, welcome to Many Questions. What is perfectionism? It's a term that's constantly thrown about, but do we actually know what it means? Or how it relates to your mental health? I sat down with a researcher at the University of Glasgow, Dr. Marianne Etherson, to discuss perfectionism's effect on one's mental health, and why being perfect isn't always great.
Huh?
So, what attracted you to the field of perfectionism, and what is it?
So I'd say I'm very perfectionistic. So when I first came across perfectionism, I was actually in my undergraduate degree, and I thought perfectionism just related to me completely. I was really fascinated by it because it helped me better understand myself and my behaviors. So I think that's why I've been researching it for so long. So 7 years now, I think. Um, Perfectionism is a personality trait that is characterized by the setting of irrational standards and harsh self-criticism. The most widely used or conceptualized model of perfectionism has three dimensions, and this was proposed by psychologists Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt. And these dimensions are self-oriented perfectionism, which is demanding perfection from the self; socially prescribed perfectionism, which is the perception that others demand perfection of you; and other oriented perfectionism is demanding perfection from others. So you can imagine that that dimension is related to a lot of interpersonal conflict with others. And finally, there's another behavior, perfectionistic self-presentation. And this is involved with presenting the self as perfect to others, but also avoiding disclosing or displaying any signs of imperfections. So it's all about how we're perceived by others, is what the main focus of perfectionistic self-presentation is.
Is there one that's more prevalent than the others?
One is more prevalent at the moment. It's been shown to be on the rise. So it's been increasing over around the past 30 years, and that's socially prescribed perfectionism.
Mhm.
So perceiving that others demand perfection from us. This is thought to be due to the changes in our culture over these years. It's not fully tested yet, but it's thought to be due to the increasingly competitive society, the increase in social media, and also consumerism as well. So these factors are thought to be responsible for the rise in socially prescribed perfectionism.
Just looking around, which is not really a great study, but just looking around, it does feel like things are slightly changing, especially with when it comes to like social media, and I guess on a wider scale, the media in general, of like what they've pushed into our faces or like held up, and what's become popular.
Yeah.
So, what are the common causes or origins of perfectionistic tendencies?
So perfectionism is partly genetic. So
Mm.
I'd say around 30% is thought to occur through our genes. Also, most of it we perceive to develop through the environment. So particularly our interactions with our parents growing up. And more recently, as I've mentioned, the role of culture and the social environment is thought to play a role. This might be in school, sports, and also the other factors mentioned, like social media as well.
So, how does perfectionism relate to social factors?
This partly depends on the dimensions of perfectionism as well, but at its root, perfectionism is underpinned by a need to feel worthy, validated, to matter, and to feel loved. But actually, perfectionism often creates the opposite. So social disconnection from others. So yeah, it gets a little bit complicated because it does depend on the dimensions. So with self-oriented perfectionism, this dimension is thought to be related to social disconnection because of a hyper focus on achievement at the expense of forming meaningful relationships with others. They're also very hyper competitive. With socially prescribed perfectionism, it's often due to interpersonal sensitivity, so how we perceive our interactions with others. We often, if we're high in socially prescribed perfectionism, we often perceive them to be negative, and we feel that we can never please other people. So we feel like we don't matter to other people. With other oriented perfectionism, it's more to do with interpersonal hostility. So demanding perfection from others creates a lot of conflict with others. So, with perfectionistic self presentation, we often create a false front and we seem inauthentic to others. So, that often actually creates disconnection from others when the goal is to gain validation and approval.
That's really a shame because I guess you're trying all of these different things to be loved, and it's actually pushing you further from people.
Yeah, it's the behaviors and the thoughts of perfectionists that are causing this. And it is a shame because it is creating the opposite effect.
I guess just growing up, it was always, I don't know if this is the negative side of culture, but it was always that kind of push where you have to be as close to perfectionism as possible. And we've always shown the benefits of it, especially when you see stuff like athletes and top creatives and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a time where there is a benefit to perfectionism?
Most researchers would say no, because it's largely viewed as negative, because at the beginning it might lead to slightly greater achievement. For instance, self-oriented perfectionism has been found to lead to achievement, but socially prescribed perfectionism hasn't. But over time, due to the psychological stress, the stress associated with perfectionism, it leaves people vulnerable to all these negative outcomes, which actually undermines performance in the long run. So that is the view that I would take, that over time perfectionism is always negative and other aspects should be encouraged. Not perfectionism, things like conscientiousness, striving for excellence. But I think we should not be encouraging perfectionism, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about certain times where I've been trying to go for a high level and missing it, but because of like through my life, it's always been like you have to get the highest, or do this at the best.
Yeah.
That it kind of diminishes all your progress and all everything else that you've kind
Yeah.
of done.
Yeah, so perfectionists often struggle to feel proud of their achievements. So we
Mm.
see that with Victoria Pendleton, who never seemed to be satisfied with any of her success, despite achieving a lot of things. So that's what perfectionism is. It's setting a rational standard. So an A star, but not being happy with an A is kind of associated with, it's what creates a lot of this distress. So if we were just to set quite realistic standards, but still challenging standards, then we wouldn't be experiencing all this distress.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what can we do to try and stop this?
So, yeah, it's more about not completely getting rid of perfectionism, because that's not really possible. It's a personality trait, it's quite ingrained.
Hmm.
So, it's about managing perfectionism. Some of the things we can do is to set more realistic standards, still challenging, but just slightly more in reach, so we don't experience all this distress and worry. Also, being a lot more self compassionate. So, a core component of perfectionism is self-criticism. So yeah, just being a bit kinder to ourselves can help manage our perfectionism. Also, accepting what we don't have control over, such as the culture and the environment. And if perfectionism is affecting our mental health, then CBT has been shown to be effective in reducing perfectionism. So if it's getting quite severe, then seek help from a professional.
So, can someone completely overcome perfectionistic tendencies?
I'd say they couldn't completely overcome them, but definitely, particularly if they're just, that's naturally how they are. It's a personality trait, but it is managing them, I would say, and just using sort of the tips that I've just mentioned. I think that would be the way forward, really.
Does perfectionism affect certain age groups of people more so, or is it something that can really just affect you at any time in your life?
It is something that can affect you any time in your life. We were going to do a study that examines whether perfectionism changes throughout the lifespan. So that is something that we do need to research more about, I would say. But the study that's showing perfectionism is rising is within college students. And that's an age group that are thought to be particularly affected by perfectionism, because they're the ones that are experiencing a huge amount of pressure, particularly like in the job market and things like that. So it's not clear, but particularly young people, perfectionism is thought to be affecting.
I can understand, especially with so many courses that you're doing, and then having to maybe juggle life, dealing with your family stuff, and working, and all of that happening in that period of your life. It might be very, very difficult for some people.
Yeah.
With perfectionism, it affects various different aspects to your life. But one thing that's really important to us at MQ is premature mortality.
Hmm.
So, can perfectionism lead to suicidal ideation?
Yeah, definitely. And a study has also found that it leads to premature death as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, definitely there's a number of pathways. So that's what I'm researching right now. The link between perfectionism and suicidal ideation is quite complex, but the models so far haven't really incorporated the complex interplay of all the different factors. But perfectionism is often interacts with factors such as stressful life events, and perfectionists magnify these events. So that's what creates a lot of the worry and rumination, but also factors like defeat and entrapment, which is within one of the models of suicide, which I'm currently researching. So there are numerous pathways, and it's not fully clear how perfectionism contributes to suicide ideation, but it is the interaction of numerous factors and also social factors as well. The disruption of relationships is definitely contributing to that as well.
I guess all we can do is offer support. So if anybody was feeling that way, there's various different charities, and there's support sections on off our website that I can link below. So I guess you was talking about society when it comes
Yeah.
to perfectionism. So where does social media come into this? What's the role of social media when it comes to perfectionism?
So, one of our studies, we found that perfectionists are vulnerable to the negative effects of social media. So, they are using social media in a negative way, and perfectionists have an underlying sense of inferiority. So, they're the individuals that might use social media to make negative social comparisons with others and to feel worse about themselves because of this. And social media does present people's perfect lives, showing all their best highlights, and we often compare our reality to their best versions of themselves. So I think that's why perfectionists are particularly vulnerable.
So yeah, talking about the media, what can the media do to help more people?
I think the media need to incorporate stricter regulations, and particularly things like Instagram. I know there's age restrictions as well. I think it's important that people are clear when they're promoting brands and ads, which I now know that they have to do that if they are promoting, like influencers are promoting brands. But I think any way they can sort of make clearer the realities rather than allowing people to present the sort of perfect versions of themselves, which is quite difficult to do, but there would be some regulations that can help manage perfectionism in social media.
I guess we're coming to the end of this. As we're a mental health research charity, if you had all the money in the world and all the means, what's the one question that you'd love mental health research to answer?
I think I'm going to keep this to my topic of perfectionism and suicide. So, there is a lack of research on this relationship, and I think it's a really important relationship. So, for me personally, I'd be investigating that. I'd conduct longitudinal studies to examine people over time to see what is really causing, and examining the distinct mechanisms that are occurring between perfectionism and suicide ideation. So that is also a focus of my research going forward.
Well, let's hope you get all the money and the means. Yeah, because then we can get that solved. So I guess the last question, and this is my favorite question, is what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
So I think that is a tough question as well, but I'm going to keep it quite specific to perfectionism. So my piece of advice is don't sweat the small stuff. So perfectionists, like I've mentioned before, when they're exposed to any setback, failure, negative life event, they often magnify it into something huge. So I think perfectionists in particular need to focus on what is important in life And that is really our relationships with others. So they need to alter their behaviors a bit to ensure that they're not being disconnected from others, because I think that is really important, especially for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you, Marianne, for this lovely episode. I was able to learn quite a lot about perfectionism. I've only known the kind of cultural type of aspects to it, but I'm glad to know that there's so much research into this area so that we can truly understand instead of breaking down some of these myths about it. If anybody wanted to get in touch with you, how could they do so?
So I think maybe the main way is Twitter. I also have an account on Psychology Today, so I post different articles on perfectionism, all perfectionism related. I've got some on authenticity, social disconnection, social anxiety, etc. So if you're wanting to know more about perfectionism generally, maybe go there.
Well, thank you again. I'll put all the links below to all of that. And thank you for talking with us. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.